Welcome to Science Actually, a podcast by Imperial College London students and staff. In our podcast, we explore the misconception around the human body. In each episode, a member of a podcast team interviews Imperial's experts to see if they have the answers to our burning questions.
Can drugs of abuse have health benefits? I am Elena, a final year medical biosciences student from the Science Actually team, and this episode we will be exploring some of the drugs associated with nightlife and student culture with Dr. Christian. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Nice to be here.
Dr. Christian is a reader in pharmacology at Imperial College London. He holds a PhD in pharmacology and has led the delivery of pharmacology teaching within the Faculty of Medicine for many years. He also continues with his research into the link between stress and disease. So, Chris, the big question here is, can drugs of abuse have health benefits?
Okay, so obviously that's a very, very broad area we're starting with. So there are a great many drugs of abuse. So it would very much depend sort of which drugs you were talking about. But if let's just go nice and straightforward to start with, and let's say you've kind of got generally stimulants, the likes of sort of nicotine, caffeine would be in there, amphetamines, things like that. And then obviously you've got depressants, alcohol would be classified as a depressant. Cannabis certainly has depressant properties. The opioids, heroin and the like, they have depressant properties. And many of those drugs, have health benefits. Some of them are specifically used, in health. The opioids are still very much used as analgesics. Not heroin necessarily, but, there are many different opioids that can have that sort of analgesic effect. So absolutely, many of the drugs of abuse have health benefits.
If we start with alcohol, as a Spaniard, I have grown up in a society where it was perceived as normal for parents to have a couple of beers. Then, moving to the UK, I have been introduced to a very different atmosphere where binge drinking is the norm. So, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that alcohol could be beneficial in reducing stress and other aspects, and to which limit?
Okay, so I think one thing you'll hear me talk about a lot, both to students and to the sort of general public when I'm talking about pharmacology, is the whole idea of dose and, how much are we talking about for any drug? And generally speaking, I can think of a few drugs, but in most cases, if you're going to occasionally take relatively low to moderate doses of any drug, that the negative health consequences are pretty minimal. And that holds for most of the drugs of abuse. If we're going to be absolutely honest, if you were to take them at low, moderate dose, every so often, you're probably not going to see a lot of negative consequences. Now, obviously, as the dose escalates, that's when both positive and negative consequences can increase. If we're talking about alcohol specifically, it's a very interesting question in terms of, does low dose alcohol have beneficial effects? Generally speaking, why do people regularly consume alcohol? If we sort of ignore maybe student life and sort of binge drinking, if you're talking about what you said, that you were used to seeing sort of alcohol on the table, a glass a night or what have you, alcohol is a depressant, so people take alcohol to relax, to calm down. There's a reason why people tend to drink alcohol at the end of the day, when they want to chill, when they want to relax. There's a reason why they drink caffeine at the other end of the day, because caffeine's a stimulant and they want to wake up and what have you. So I don't think there's a big deal. There's not a big deal in terms of having maybe a glass of wine a night in terms of long-term health consequences. Is it beneficial is a slightly different question. There's all sorts of evidence. It doesn't all agree. Probably what you'd say is low dose alcohol is beneficial for some parameters in some people. The drugs of abuse in general are so emotive when you start talking about them that sometimes the sort of politics that surrounds it isn't necessarily matched by the amount of science we have to actually back up some of those statements.
You said that alcohol is responsible for feeling somewhat more relaxed and sociable. Can we be tricked by non-alcoholic alternatives to feel the same ways, or it's something unique to alcohol?
So I think there's all the power of suggestion is a real thing. So, you can, the placebo effect is a real thing. So if you're taking something that you think will relax you, then there's a very, very good chance in many individuals that it will. And that is probably true of sort of non-alcoholic lager. There's a similar taste, so that there's a lot of the sensations that are working up into the brain that are familiar, that are associated with relaxing, being more sociable, whatever it might be. And therefore, yes, there's every possibility that non-alcoholic drinks are going to induce the same sort of feelings. Again, if we're comparing sort of low dose alcohol with an alcohol-free drink, everything, once the dose starts to escalate, then it's a different kettle of fish.
On the other hand, CBD oil, which is an oil taken from cannabis, has been marketed as a potential cure for pain, anxiety, and a host of other problems. What do you think about these claims? Is it great marketing, or are there real benefits to be had?
So the whole pharmacology of cannabis is very interesting. So I'd say there's definitely health benefits to be had. It might help to first just talk about cannabidiol and cannabis. So cannabis effectively is a plant that contains a lot of different compounds, cannabidiol being one of them. Now, there's another compound that's probably worth talking about here, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, otherwise known as delta-9 THC. So if we don't worry too much about CBD, cannabidiol, to start with, and we actually focus on delta-9 THC, delta-9 THC for a long time was believed to be the cannabinoid, the compound within cannabis that produced all the effects that people wanted. So euphoria and any of the other sort of effects, pain relief and what have you. And as a result, the sort of varieties of the cannabis plant that were developed, in the last century, moving into this century, things like skunk, they had much higher concentrations of delta-9 THC, whereas the cannabidiol concentrations were decreased. And what we've realised is that delta-9 THC, yes, it probably is very beneficial if you want the euphoric effect, i.e. if you want to feel good, if you want to feel happy. But some of the negative effects associated with cannabis are definitely associated with THC as well. Things like the psychosis that's commonly associated with THC. And what we've come to realise is that the cannabidiol, the CBD, seems to protect. It directly seems to oppose the effects of the delta-9 THC. So relatively recent evidence has started to show that it's the CBD that decreases the psychotic effects. Yes, because it interferes with THC, it's also going to decrease the euphoric effect, the feeling happy. But a lot of the positive effects of cannabis, the pain relief, the ability to reduce feelings of anxiety, they seem to be more induced by the cannabidiol. Hence why we now have cannabidiol as a separate product being marketed for pain relief, for anxiety disorders. And that is a very real effect. Down the line, we need to know what the effects of chronic, long-term cannabidiol use is. But for now, definitely cannabidiol does seem to have the positive effects attributed to it.
One of the most common things or misconceptions that I've heard correlate alcohol and cannabis, its ability to kill brain cells. Is this true for both?
If we're talking about sort of long-term impact of cannabis and alcohol on the brain, we know a lot more about alcohol than we do about cannabis. And this is one of the problems with the drugs of abuse. The legal drugs like alcohol, like nicotine, they're easy to study because that's not a problem to recruit volunteers. Other drugs, cocaine, cannabis and what have you, the illicit drugs, that's a lot more difficult to recruit participants to take part in long-term studies. So therefore, our understanding of some of the long-term impact of drugs of abuse, some of the drugs of abuse, is not well developed at all. Now, yes, with alcohol, we know that long-term alcohol use, particularly high levels, is very damaging to the brain. Cannabis, less clear. One of the things you tend to find with most drugs, in fact, that if you take them chronically, the body adapts and tries to compensate. So as a result, you can imagine if you were to take cannabis long term, then that region of the brain might adapt. So as a result, then you have a modified brain structure that when you remove cannabis, you might see negative consequences because that brain structure has changed.
Now that we are more familiar with the dangers and possible health benefits of these drugs of abuse, how will this compare to stimulants?
Stimulants tend to speed everything up. Now, that stimulant effect can still be beneficial, sometimes in strange ways. We use stimulants to treat attention deficit disorder, for example, when you would think that the last thing you want is to speed things up. So, sometimes pharmacology is slightly counterintuitive, but there certainly are stimulant drugs that we utilize therapeutically for various disorders.
So myself, as a uni student, I'm a frequent consumer of caffeine in order to try to hijack that mechanism to stay more alert, awake before an exam. Hence, would stimulants, which we are aware of, or new stimulants, be beneficial for society or for some aspects?
There's lots of evidence looking at stimulants and performance. And in some cases, it's very, very positive. In some cases, it's less clear. So stimulants are going to make you more alert. They're going to make you more awake. In terms of cognitive performance, which really means the ability of the brain to function well when dealing with things like concentration, memory, it's not quite so clear-cut. For example, it might make you faster, but it might make you less accurate, as an example. There's so much evidence, some of it that the more complex the cognitive problem, the less clear we are whether stimulants are good or bad, and actually they might get in the way to a certain degree. So in terms of keeping you awake so you can revise for 14 hours, that is certainly going to be the case with most stimulants. In terms of will it enhance your performance during an actual exam, that's less clear-cut.
Great. I think I will have to relook at my coffee dosage then. So if drug regulation was to be reset again, which drug do you believe is safest or should be legal, if any?
Yeah, a very charged question. So when you're talking about, reclassifying the drugs of abuse, there's so much that goes into that. Obviously, you're worried about harm, the harm that the drug can do to that person. Sometimes you're worried about the harm that drug might cause to someone else. You've got to worry about certain social issues. You've got to worry about their addictive potential. And again, I'm not entirely sure that the science quite keeps pace with the questions being asked. Lots of people often say, how on earth is alcohol classified effectively by our current systems? How come alcohol can be classified as safer, if that's the right word, than something like cannabis? And it is, it's an interesting question. And at a very, very basic level, certainly the dangers of alcohol are probably under classified, and the dangers of cannabis may be over. Again, going back a little bit to talking about dose, I said I'd keep talking about dose as a pharmacologist. We've already said that low dose infrequent use, you're probably not too worried about most drugs, to be honest. We probably have, from animal studies, we probably have a fair idea of overdose. So lethality, whether a drug could potentially kill someone at high dose. And then there's an awful lot of unknown in the middle. If you take sort of mild, moderate doses chronically, what are the health consequences? And I think that's some of the things we grapple with when we think about drug classification. If you were going to, try and reclassify, you'd need to weave all of those things in. And then the environment is constantly changing as well, which just complicates matters, because the speed with which new drugs of abuse are being developed, is frightening. So constantly trying to figure out where to place those. And, as an example, there are synthetic cannabinoids. So you might say cannabis probably should be classified as lower risk, but then you've got synthetic cannabinoids that are coming onto the market that seem even more powerful than cannabis, that have greater risk, and you're having to constantly deal with that. So, I would never want to be someone who was in a position who had to make those decisions, because they're certainly not straightforward.
Well, this issue also made me think of another case within legal drugs. For example, how habits are changing as people move away from tobacco smoking onto vaping, as they think to be taking the less harmful option. Could you tell us about what you think about this?
Another example where, on the one hand, we've got a load of evidence around cigarettes and limited evidence around e-cigarettes. And there is a concern there. At a basic level, what are we talking about? We're talking about nicotine. And broadly speaking, there's a similar amount of nicotine in cigarettes as there are in e-cigarettes in terms of vaping. It varies obviously from brand to brand. Our understanding of how that nicotine gets into the body from the e-cigarette is still developing. And then I guess the big thing, if we're worried about the sort of danger and the harm of these things, is we know that a lot of the harm associated with cigarettes is not related to nicotine. It's related to all the other things that are present within nicotine smoke. You've got benzene, you've got carbon monoxide, you've got all sorts of things that you really, really shouldn't be inhaling into your lungs. There's a lot of volatile organic matter in the vaping smoke as well. We just are less clear on what the long-term impact of inhaling that into your lungs over a period of time will be. So I guess, my concern would probably be that 20, 30 years from now, that is when we're finally going to understand what the impact is. And always the industry is not going to be as concerned about that until the evidence is slapping them in the face. So there's always that worry that there's this big push to sort of vaping. Clearly the tobacco industry is, putting a lot of money into advertising. Plenty of evidence that the young are increasingly using sort of e-cigarettes, and that's a concern. It feels like we've been here before with cigarettes, and the worry is that we're just repeating the same mistake again, just with a slightly different version of nicotine. And then the final point, I guess, to make is that nicotine does have health consequences, mainly cardiovascular. So, we always worry with chronic smokers about their cardiovascular health, and that's not going to change if someone chronically uses a vape or an e-cigarette. The pharmaceutical industry have been tinkering with drug structures for a long time to try and produce useful therapeutic agents, and we can go back over 100 years, and heroin was actually produced by the pharmaceutical industry. There was a problem with morphine addiction, and they wanted to produce a non-addictive opioid, and heroin was the result. So not a great example in terms of a positive outcome, because heroin is definitely a lot more addictive than morphine.
Chris, so you look quite a bit cynical on this. Is it because you're a scientist, or what are your thoughts on it?
In terms of drug regulation, that is a complex beast, and I'm certainly not cynical about that in any way. It is very, very difficult, and there are a lot of competing interests. Clearly, obviously, in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, the tobacco industry, or sort of any industry that is trying to sell a product, I think you probably need to have a slightly cynical eye, because they're there to make money. And we've seen examples where the drug industry can obscure data, shall we say, that maybe doesn't paint their products in the greatest light. I'm very, very, very well aware that for one drug to make it to market can cost millions, sometimes, many, many millions, of pounds, of dollars, of whatever currency to get there. So there is a lot invested in making sure that these drugs make it to market. And if you're a drug company that has spent, let's say, £10 million, and at the last hurdle, there's a bit of data that doesn't paint your drug in the best light, you can see why maybe that data might be presented in a particular way, shall we say. I won't go full on cynicism. So my last soundbite for you, they reckon it's about 270 million people use one drug of abuse or another. So that's 5% of the world's population.
Interesting fact.
Okay, thank you very much, Elena. Nice talking to you.
Thanks, Chris, for your overview on the present and stimulant drugs of abuse and their regulation, exploring both their benefits and risks from a pharmacology point of view. We asked you a really big question, hence we really did got a big answer.